So, crop sensor versus full frame. Which one's better? It's a bit of a non-issue. Basically, it really doesn't matter that much, it just depends on what you're using your camera for. In this video, I'm going to be running through a few pros and cons of full frame and crop sensors, and hopefully that will give you some sort of idea about which one is more suited to you. Let's start way at the beginning. Full frame and crop sensor refers to the size of the sensor. Crop frame sensors come in a variety of different flavors. So you've got APS-C, which is 1.5 times crop. You've got APS-H, which is 1.6 times crop. And you've got Micro Four Thirds, which is a 2 times crop. The 1.5, 1.6, 2 times crop is the crop factor, and the crop factor refers to how much smaller the sensor is. So for instance, in the examples I'm going to show you, a full frame 35mm lens on a crop sensor camera will appear more like the field of view of a 50mm lens or thereabouts. So today we're going to be using the A7R Mark II as our full frame sensor, and then we're going to be using the A6300 as our APS-C sensor. But before we really get into it, I just want to mention that the size of your sensor does not determine a better or a worse resolution. Today we're going to be focusing on video because, well, this channel's more about video than it is about photography, and both the A6300 and the A7R Mark II both shoot in 4K, and that is what we're going to be doing, 4K UHD on both. Both images are going to be exactly the same size. Okay, so let's get into it. One of the main misconceptions about full frame sensors is that they produce a shallower depth of field, and this is kind of false. Depth of field is determined by a few different factors, and that is the distance to your subject, your focal length, and your aperture. You can use all three of these to change the depth of field, making it shallower or deeper. I did a video about lenses. It was actually the first video that I put on this channel, so if you do decide to watch it, try not to laugh, but there is some information in there about lenses, aperture, and depth of field, and I'll pop the link in the description below, as well as put one of those little card things up there somewhere. Basically, with a crop frame sensor, all you have to do is have a think about your crop factor and perform a little bit of maths. Yes, maths. Then you can get an image that is very similar to a full frame camera. It's all about understanding what your camera can do and understanding how to change your depth of field, so you can still get that separation between foreground and background. Okay, so let's have a look at this example. Here is the 35mm on a full frame and the 35mm on a crop frame sensor. As you can see, the 35mm on a full frame looks a lot wider than the 35mm on a crop sensor. Now the 35mm on the crop sensor is actually projecting a 35mm image into the camera, but the sensor, being a lot smaller, is only picking up that small section. So in order to work out what the equivalent frame size is, we have to take 35mm and times it by the crop factor, which is 1.5 for an APS-C sensor. So 35 by 1.5 is 52.5. Now let's go to 50, that's around about what it is. We're not being perfect here, we're just trying to get our heads around how the crop factor works. So a 35 on a crop sensor is closer to a 50mm in terms of the field of view, but the depth of field will be the same as it were on a 35 full frame. So now let's have a look at full frame on a 50mm, and you can see that they're pretty much identical, except full frame on a 50mm is a little bit of a shallower depth of field, simply because we've changed our focal length. So to combat this, we need to have a look at applying that crop factor onto our aperture and our ISO. So on the crop frame sensor, we were at f4. So we need to divide that by 1.5, which will get us our new f-stop, making our new f-stop 2.66 recurring. So let's say that's 2.8 because that's wide open on this lens. When we get to 2.8, we must remember to change our ISO as well so that both images look the same in terms of exposure. Because we're not being exact, it's not going to be perfectly right, but you can see the effect we're going for here. So if we divide our ISO of 800 by 1.5, we end up getting roughly 500 ISO. So let's switch down to 500 ISO, and there you go, you've got a shallower depth of field on a 35mm lens on a crop sensor, which looks like a 50 on a full frame. Using this sort of method can be incredibly useful if you're doing jobs where maybe you can't get as close to the action as you would like shooting a live event, or maybe doing wildlife photography or videography, where you may not be able to get as close as you would like to your subject. You can still get the advantage of having a telephoto lens. However, the downside to this is your wide-angle lenses might be a bit more difficult to come by. Moving on from this, one of the major pros of a crop frame camera is actually the weight, the size, and also the price. Crop frame cameras are typically lighter, cheaper, and much more compact than a full frame setup. They come in at pretty much half the price of a full frame setup in most cases, and they make really good second bodies if you're looking for a second camera to have on a shoot, as well as being a good first camera, or if you need to be light, compact, agile, maybe you do travel photography or something like that and you need to keep into one bag, maybe they're a good option for you. A major pro of shooting with a full frame camera is that in most cases they're better in low light scenarios, because the pixels aren't as packed into a smaller sensor on a crop frame. They're actually more spread out and they're able to gather more light, therefore creating a less noisy image and a cleaner image. However, sensors are getting better and better, and this gap is becoming more narrow. It's seriously becoming less of an issue as the days go on, if it even was an issue in the first place. So I hope this helped you in some way, shape, or form in terms of understanding crop factor and how you can use a crop sensor to achieve a similar result to a full frame camera. Hopefully it's also helped you if you're looking for a camera and maybe you're in the marketplace, you're unsure if you want to get a crop or a full frame sensor. I would recommend having a look at both. And if you're going to look at lenses between them both, I would highly recommend applying the crop factor to your aperture as well, so that you have a better understanding of what that camera can do. Remember that ultimately a good image is up to you and you alone. It doesn't matter about the camera you are using and the specs of that camera. Yes, it does help, but really ultimately it's up to you. So get out there and keep practicing no matter what budget you have, no matter what camera you have, because you will still progress. I also just wanted to say at the end of this video, we've got a whole lot of new subscribers because I got a shout out on another channel, which was amazing. So welcome to all of you newbies here. I'd love to know where you're all from. So I'm gonna leave a little comment down below. If you would like to reply to that comment with where you are from, that would be really interesting to me because I know you're from all over the world. Thank you so much for coming by. Thank you so much for viewing the content, for liking it, for commenting, for all of your kind words. It's really lovely of you and it's nice to have you on board. So I look forward to bringing you more content in the future. Thank you so much. And if you enjoyed that video, please remember to give it a big fat thumbs up. And if you would like to see more of my face and maybe learn a little bit more about filmmaking in the process, please remember to subscribe, and I'll see you next Sunday.